I want to welcome all of you who are attending this webcast uh, presented by Societe de Chimie Industriale. My name is Peter Young. I'm president of the organization, but also head of programs. And I'm very pleased to welcome all of you and also welcome a wonderful set of panelists today on entrepreneurism. I'm just going to briefly make a couple of comments before I turn it over to Marc Reisch, who is the moderator for this webcast, but also happens to be head of the education committee of Societe de Chimie Industriale. Briefly about Societe, it's a 102-year-old organization that was founded really to accomplish a number of things. One is to provide a vehicle for educating and informing people related to the chemical industry, but also to recognize people who've made contributions to the industry through award dinners. But we have a wide range of activities ranging from mentor programs for students, scholarships that we give for research by students at the graduate and undergraduate level. We have a series of webcasts. They used to be in-person meetings, but now they're webcasts every month on important issues, and so on and so forth. I encourage all of you to get on our mailing list so you can attend our events, but also to be a member if you're interested, where there are a number of benefits to being a member. The last thing I want to say is that in terms of upcoming events, the next meeting will be the annual elections and annual report of the officers. The good news for you is that portion of the meeting is short. It's on December 9th from 1 o'clock. And then at 1:30, I will give a couple of slides, and then we're going to have a virtual discussion group on the topic of the impact of the pandemic on the chemical industry. So although I'll give a couple of slides, the main emphasis for that 1 hour period is really to get all those people who register and attend to have the opportunity to share their views, but also to hear and learn from other people who are on the webcast. I encourage you to join that meeting. I think you'll find it very interesting, and obviously many people are struggling with how to make changes everywhere from how their people work to how they manufacture to how they supply, but also where things are headed in terms of the pandemic and the economy. So with that, I will turn this over to Marc Reisch, who will introduce our panelists to the topic, but also act as moderator for this event.
Thank you, Peter. Hello, my name is Marc Reisch. I chair Societe's Education Committee. Among our activities are these series of webinars. We've had one back in June, which discussed the COVID epidemic and how to maintain your career path during that period of time. We also sponsored a webinar with the American Chemical Society featuring the heads of R&D at DuPont and BASF, talking a bit about how to also manage their careers. And in this particular webinar, we will look at startups and the job opportunities that exist there. The Societe also sponsors a couple of scholarships, 6 for minority scholars at through the American Chemical Society. And then we sponsor 9 students to do summer research at schools, Columbia University, in the chemistry department, the engineering department at Columbia, and also in New York University's chemistry department. And so let's see, today we have 3 speakers. We have Fran Waller, who spent a number of years at Air Products and DuPont, and also has taught organic chemistry, I think at Lehigh University, if I remember right, Fran. Roshan Shetty, who's been closely involved in a number of startups, a number of them in the instrumentation field. and currently has his own startup, which I'll tell you a bit about in a moment. And Dave Patteson, who's a operating partner at the venture capital firm Ampersand Capital, and also heads up a instrumentation firm and startup, has been closely involved with startups. Advion is the name that comes to mind for his most recent firm, but I think it recently merged, and he can tell you a bit about that as well. And so to start off, I'm going to ask each of our panelists to talk a little bit about their background for about 2 or 3 minutes, tell us how they became involved in the startup scene, and this way you'll get a good sense of who they are and where they're coming from. And so, Fran, would you like to start?
Yes, good afternoon, everybody. My background is in the area of organic chemistry with about 31 years of industrial science as an industrial scientist. I have taught undergraduate and graduate courses in organic chemistry, material science, and polymer science. For the last 40 to 45 years, I have been an investor in the stock market and built a portfolio of 40 to 50 publicly traded companies. Now I wanted to explore an opportunity to invest in private companies. Therefore, in 2014, I joined an angel group as an accredited investor. And all that means I must follow certain rules and guidelines provided by the SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission. I presently find, screen, perform due diligence, and invest in early to late stage startups. And it's a pleasure to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Fran. And Roshan, how about you?
Hey, good afternoon. Usually probably start from the introductions circulated. I recently had a couple of good outcomes. Two of my startups have been acquired, but there's a long period of struggle that went behind that. So I'll talk a little bit about that so you get a sense of my perspective. I have a couple of graduate degrees in EE in optical sciences. I worked in the Silicon Valley Bay Area firm called KLA-Tencor for a few years. Then I got an MBA in INSEAD in Paris. I followed that with investment banking, so IPOs, mergers and acquisitions. And then during the internet wave, I decided to do my own thing. So I left banking and I moved back to Paris to create a company with a classmate of mine. We raised a fair bit of money, a lot of money actually. And we got up to 100 employees with offices all over, and then had to deal with the dot-com crash and had to fire most of those employees. So I left that experience with a lot of startups and not much to show for it other than the experience itself. And then I had to go through a fair bit of soul searching as to what I wanted to do. I was in my early 30s at the time. So during that period of reflection, I realized the things I enjoyed, I enjoyed the uncertainty and the opportunity and the freedom that came with being in a cutting edge sector that was just happening and had a lot of growth in front of it. But what I didn't like about the internet was the lack of a barrier to entry. Anybody could get in, and there was not, a very strong barrier to entry. So that sort of shaped my next move. And nanotechnology was the next big wave happening here in the US at the time, or worldwide, but mostly driven by the US. So I liked the barrier to entry in nanotechnology, and I could leverage a lot of my prior background, in the scientific field. So I started working at Vico for a couple of years, where I was the head of business development for them, and they were the leading instrumentation firm in the nano instruments arena. I worked there for a couple of years, and that's when the idea for Anesys came, and and then I guess I'll get into the rest of it later. But that led to creation of Anesys, which I more or less bootstrapped along with my co-founders that I'd met at Vico, along with AR Biomed. Both of them had good outcomes, and now I'm in my third startup now, Photothermal.
Thanks very much, Roshan. David, how about you?
Yeah, so I'm the oddball here. I don't have a background in the pure sciences per se. I have two separate bachelor's degrees that are very disparate, and then I picked up an executive MBA at IMD in Switzerland in the early 90s. But my first spit out was in the late 70s. I worked for a German engineering company in the early 1980s, and I was, at the age of 27, I sort of had a career crisis, and I was like, I don't want to do this anymore. So I answered an ad in the Washington Post to be a national sales manager for a visible spectrophotometer company. Went in for the interview, and they said, you know what, you could do this, but we have something else in mind. And it was a near-infrared and mid-infrared instrumentation instrument they had developed. So it's molecular spectroscopy. And as anybody knows, that is the confluence of Beer's law and a tremendous amount of statistics. Well, my undergrad degree and my background was I loved statistics. So I jumped into that, and they said that they were the leader in the field. In year one, we had $600,000 worth of sales. So we were nothing. It was nascent. And 5 years later, we were tremendously larger, and we sold the business to a Swedish publicly traded company. I stayed on for some years after that and ran their North American operations. And then I decided to get into a much larger field, process instrumentation and controls, and ended up running a company that was about $250 million and had 1,250 employees. And I've never enjoyed anything less. So I left that and joined another small company called Biotage. If any of you are chemists, everybody sort of knows Biotage, synthesis and purification equipment. And they have revenues today, I think, of about 130, 140 million. When I joined them as CEO, we were doing $4 million a year. And 6 years later, we were doing 70 million. We sold that business, and then I joined Advion, the company that Mark talked about, venture capital and private equity-backed company, contract research, and then mass spectrometry, ion sources, and systems. We grew that out and sold that in two-piece parts over about a 10-year period. So number of acquisitions, a number of exits, and a lot of lessons learned along the way.
Great, thank you. And what I thought I'd do is start with a question about opportunities for chemists, chemical engineers, and biochemists today. And can you talk a little bit about what sort of jobs seekers can expect and where they can find these opportunities? Are they in pharmaceuticals, diagnostics, battery development, sustainable chemistries? I mean, just as a broad overview, where is there a need for people at startups today? How about we'll start with you, Dave, and then work our way around too.
Well, it's almost uncountable where the opportunities are. So maybe it's better to perhaps characterize them as opposed to to place bets on certain ponies. But I mean, certainly clinical diagnostics, RT-PCR, CRISPR, microbiome, anything in the field of chemical biology is very hot right now. But there's always going to be, this is the good news for anybody who's listening to this, whether you're coming out with a bachelor's or master's or PhD, you're always going to have ample opportunities. So maybe another way to think about it is it depends on what you want to do. If you're planning to go to work in a lab somewhere, I'm just being honest with you, okay? And if you want to stay in the science field, it'd be very difficult for you with a bachelor's or master's degree to ever get to sort of a director level or higher. If you have a PhD or a postdoc, it's an unfair advantage, and it really jumpstarts your career, especially if you have an industrial postdoc. That's not to say that your careers are limited, because if you go in and you do that work, you can redeploy into a business or commercial environment thereafter. So I don't want to dominate the conversation here, and I'm going to let other people join in here. But I've never been more sanguine or rosy about a future for someone in the field of chemistry or chemical biology or biochemistry than I am today. And I have a son who's graduating with his PhD in the next 2 or 3 months, and he's got the world as his oyster.
Great. Roshan, would you agree with that assessment?
Well, mine would be a little more of a micro perspective than David's macro overview. It's sort of more instrumentation and the companies I've been involved with. And within that, going back to just to add something to what David said, it's true, in a way you have to make, so maybe you don't know the answer to that, but you want to be involved in sort of the making. Ultimately, a company, broadly has only two parts. Either you're making the product or you're selling it, or you're interfacing both parts. To make the product is R&D and engineering. And in most of the fields that David mentioned, what you just asked about, Mark, you need a PhD to really advance past a certain level. Now, that doesn't mean that with a bachelor's or master's, you start work, and maybe in a way, it's better to do that before you go get your PhD, because you can find out what you're really interested in. If you find that you're really interested in this stuff, you can go back to school for a PhD, and you would be better at it as a student if you kind of have a good idea of what the work life is like and what you're going to end up doing afterward. But that said, from going back to your specific question about the opportunities, in the instrumentation arena that I'm involved in, which is sort of a picks and shovels model to the ultimate research and the customer-facing end-using benefits. So for an instrumentation field, the opportunities for somebody starting off are, would be either most logical place, unless you are a, subject matter expert and you can get in the R&D of the instrument, which means the only way you'd get in the R&D of the instrument is if you, well, the only way, there's always a way, but the most easiest way for you to get involved in R&D is if that was the subject of your PhD and for some reason we'd taken that research out of your lab or whatever, then it'd be, you'd get an R&D, you'd be in the sweet spot of things, all that kind of stuff. Otherwise, it's more difficult and for you to know the very specific things and that startup is involved in, and then you'd have to have some general expertise in that area. So R&D is one area. So, going back to general areas of building the product, which means in the R&D or engineering side, or if you're not certain, and you have a PhD, then an application scientist is also a very, normal way to get started, where you'd get involved in the use of the product with customers. You'd be working with customers and using the product on their samples and proving to them the value of it. And again, to get involved in either one of these fields, it's easiest to get involved with things that you have worked with in your PhD, or if you're undergrad or master's, in your master's lab, you have some familiarity with the technology. If you have zero familiarity, you're not sure, then your best bet would be to join a large company which has more options, because a startup by definition is focused in one area. And either that area, and even by some miracle, if you get in, you're not going to do so well if you have no interest, no knowledge in that area. So you're better off working in a large company where you have other things to do, even if that specific thing that you pick isn't, what you want to do or you're good at.
Right, very, very good. Thanks, Roshan. Pat, you have a different perspective because you see people and a variety of different companies as well from an investor's perspective, sort of like Dave's, but where do you see the opportunities in broad subject areas?
Yeah, I'm going to be a little bit more general in my description. If a person has a chemical or an engineering or biotech background, usually in startups, there's always a demand for hands-on laboratory work. So that's a pathway. There's also a demand for laboratory supervision. Right? And since many startups have few employees, at least when they start out, your communication ability or your communication skills may come in handy. That is, you may be writing scientific documents, press releases, investor releases. You even may be asked to build and update websites. And some of you will probably have that experience. I think the most important message I can get across, if I compare a large company, as was mentioned earlier, I worked with DuPont and Air Products for my 31 years of industrial career. And if I compare a large company, publicly traded company versus a private company, the pay scale is going to be immensely different. However, in a private company, there's usually some type of deferred compensation, and that can make up a lot of differences, especially if the startup is successful. So, not to belabor a point, but I think everybody has been pretty consistent. There are people with scientific backgrounds, and everybody talked about a bachelor's, master's, PhD. There's going to be positions for you in startup companies, but you should not get disappointed at the pay scale. That's it.
Mark,
Yeah,
Mark,
please,
if
Dave.
I might, is it okay to add one thing?
Oh, sure, please.
Sure. One thing I have seen over the last 5, 6, 7 years is the Bains and the McKinseys and the Boston consulting groups and even other consulting firms have figured out that bachelor levels, master's, PhD, and in the sciences, whether it's basic or applied, have a unique ability to do incredibly unrivaled work in data analytics and dispassionate sorting of information. And I think it comes from the training that they've received, or you've received, you're out there in the audience, and the way to empirically go through and figure out what is affecting different things. And so there is a very active hiring program from these major consulting groups for people coming out of the sciences, where they would have normally just gone to MIT or Harvard or Stanford and hired a bunch of MBAs. Now they've realized these folks really know their stuff.
Yeah, that's what I'd be sort of interested in learning a little bit more about from both you, David, and Roshan and Fran, about some of the academic skills that you pick up in college. I mean, we mentioned R&D and we mentioned critical thinking, but are there other skills that you pick up in the academic arena that are particularly useful? Fran, I see you nodding your head.
Okay. As I mentioned before, there's always a hands-on laboratory work, all right? Basically, what you have learned for your particular degree, you can apply it immediately in a startup company. You will also be asked to design and build unique laboratory equipment from scratch. Sometimes you cannot buy items off the shelf. You have to create them and design them and build them yourself. 3D printing is very important in startups, in many of the startups, especially the scientific startups. Many of you have skills in chromatographic techniques, bioassays. I think David mentioned CRISPR, PCR, kinetic studies, analysis of data, which David just touched upon, machine language or coding. Something in the financial area, example, budgeting and forecasting, creative writing. How do you become concise in expressing a thought? Conflict resolution. It's a small workplace and you have to get along with everybody. So being able to resolve conflicts, I believe, is important. And being able also to negotiate your position with other people. You as an entrepreneur will have to negotiate with investors what's called a term sheet, what the investor thinks your company is worth in terms of pre-money evaluation, what you think your company is worth, that you have to compromise. And that's something I think you can pick up through a course, besides being thrown in it for the first time. Those are some of my thoughts.
Yeah, thanks. Roshan or David, did you have anything you wanted to add? Roshan, please.
Well, I have a slightly different perspective than Fran in that. Well, if I just look at my own, it's possible that college has changed and academia has changed a lot since I went to college. But also when I look at the people coming in, to repeat a point, either you've done a lot of the work for a startup like at ours, for instance, either your research and your work is directly relevant to what we're doing. In that case, you're productive from day one and it's a different path you're on. But if not, then you're basically the main utility as sort of a lot of the foundational skills, which is critical thinking. And so the basics, like, your first principles knowledge of physics and instrumentation and how you approach the problem, because you're not expected to be productive from day one. We're going to invest in, somewhat in training you on our stuff, but then how quickly you pick it up is a function of the foundational learning pieces. And some of the things Fran mentioned, these days, AI, machine learning, and data sciences, this is becoming part of the foundational tool set that's required of you. So getting your basics right in whatever field is of interest to you, is more relevant, assuming you have no direct knowledge about the product that you're involved with.
And David, did you have anything to add to that?
All of those are fantastic. I have very little to add. I would just say my experience in early stage businesses is that don't go in and think you're just going to do one thing that's on your job description. You should happily and willingly try to find everything else that's not getting done and go do it. Fill that interstitial space, and don't expect to be paid for it. Expect to be paid for it in knowledge. And wherever I've seen anyone do that, or if I've done it myself, I've never had to ask for a raise, and I've never had to ask for a promotion, because then you become indispensable and more valuable intrinsically. So just be willing to do everything you possibly can. Going back to prior comments where there was an inventory that you gave, that was of skills that are valuable. I would say becoming a confident and capable speaker and a capable writer is very, very essential. And there's so many folks in the sciences that are just absolutely brilliant that tend to struggle there. So work is that.
Yeah, I think that ties into two other themes that I was kind of curious about, and you've touched on both. One is the entrepreneurial skills that you have to pick up either on the job or anticipating other people's needs, and then the non-academic skills that you might need: business management, writing, speaking. Those all seem to be part of a well-rounded employee who works at a startup. And to what extent do you agree with that, Roshan and Pat?
Sorry, Mark, your question is on business. I didn't understand I got the background, but you're asking about business management skills in particular, is what you're saying?
Well, business management and entrepreneurial skills, what role do they play in making you a well-rounded player at a startup firm?
I mean, it's in a way what David just said, right? The initiative. I mean, these other things about being smart and hardworking and high energy, enthusiasm. I mean, sort of these are par for the course. It's sort of necessary but not sufficient. Everybody sort of has it. If not, they're not going to last very long in a startup kind of situation, because that's one thing people should understand. In a startup, you can't, or a small company, you can't hide. In a large company, there's so many things happening that even though you're not a high peak contributor, you can hide. The fact that you're not a peak person it's not gonna show up immediately. Here, it's like a small boat, and if everybody knows that everybody else is carrying their portion of the load, and if somebody's not, it's going to be fairly obvious fairly quickly. And when you're incoming employee, nobody's expecting you to carry a big load, but whatever load you're given, you're expected to hold. And what David said is hold not only your load, but try to figure out other parts of the load that you can take on. That'll become obvious quickly too. So initiative and where does one pick that up, right? So I would say besides doing your classes, getting involved in projects or internships is very important, because there's the academic world, which is ideal. You're learning from textbooks, you're doing whatever projects, the group. That's very different in my experience from the real world, when nothing happens per plan. There's things change all the time. There's inputs happening that you haven't anticipated. So being able to take somewhat a large measure more random events than compared to a tightly controlled academic setting is a useful training to get in. You get it via internships, we have projects and other things, rather than just, somebody coming, by the way, just a quick comment tied to that, GPA and grades, we almost use it as a cutoff. Sort of sometimes you use like 3 or slightly more than 3 to indicate the person's serious. But beyond that, the fact that somebody has a 4.0 really we found doesn't matter that much, in terms of will they be will they be able to lift their share of the load and take on other parts of the load.
Very good. And Pat, Fran, I know you commented on some of those skills earlier, but did you want to add anything?
Yes, I think everybody should have some basic knowledge about patents, trademarks, and trade secrets. Even if it's a very high level, what each one means. And remember, a patent would give you an exclusive license for a period of years. Presently in the United States, I think worldwide, it's about 20 years from the date of issue. Data filing, correct. Some knowledge of a business plan. Yeah. How can you determine market size? How can you determine the addressable market size? Markets can be very large in the area you're thinking about initiating a startup, but you can't address that total market. Maybe it's a $10 billion market, maybe, but if you can address maybe $1 billion of that market, because in actuality, when you start out and begin to scale up and go to a later stage company, if you can reach $100 million in that market, you've accomplished something. So I think something about your understanding of a market size, addressable market, and how to generate revenue. Since I think many of you have been involved in laboratory work, many times you run chemical reactions on a small scale, then eventually you're going to have to get to a large scale, and that's called scaling up. Being able to think about everything that's required to scale, say, a chemical reaction up or a biochemical reaction up. So that's like commercial development. I think some knowledge in that particular area is beneficial. And of course, bookkeeping, what's a profit and loss statement in a small business, a startup, that you have to worry about economics and keeping track of funds. Investors will give you money, and then you have to spend that money wisely, and every once in a while they want to report back. So you have to have some knowledge of keeping those types of things in a quarterly report or a statement of some sort. So that's some additional things I think I would add. But I think the intellectual property is very, very important. That is not taught at the undergraduate level. It's also probably not taught, at least in the chemical area, at the master's or PhD level. But understanding intellectual property, because that's how you protect your business, is very, very important.
Thank you, Fran. You've touched on something that I think is very interesting too, and that is what do you need to be a successful entrepreneur, and how do you go about raising funds? I mean, let's say you do have an idea, you've got a notion of what your patent position is, you've got some good ideas. How do you go about getting backing? What do you do to attract some money? I guess you start, if you're just at the very, very beginning, going to an angel investor such as yourself or an angel investor group. Where do you go? I mean, how do you start that whole process? How do you show your commitment to an idea? How do you get backers to actually support an inventive idea? David, yeah, please.
Okay. Well, I mean, Roshan, probably have tremendous comments here. I mean, there's a whole smorgasbord of ways to do this, but if you were to think about it in sort of a continuum of, two men, a dog, and a patent kind of thing, and then you could start with that. It could be their own funds. It could be friends and family, which is, not an uncommon way to get it going, or you could bootstrap it with grants. And depending on the type of science and the type of business that you want to start, you can write grants and get those SBIR funds. Those are bootstrap. Those are self-funded. That's not bringing in dilutive financing. Angels are going to be the sort of the first form of dilutive financing. And these are people who are typically ultra high net worth, and they're willing to place bets on different things. Then you graduate from that into institutional venture capital, where they will typically want to have a majority control of the company. It's highly dilutive. Venture capital comes in when they know the technology works, but they're not sure whether the business model is going to work. Once both the science and the business model are verified, then you graduate into private equity. And those are revenue generating companies and they're profit generating companies. Then their exit is either to a larger private equity or the company goes public. So that's sort of the typical continuum. If you're going to start a business, and I know Roshan, I think, know where his head is at, the longer you can do it yourself without bringing in dilutive external investors, the better. And the more you will get out of it eventually on an exit yourself.
Yeah, Roshan, did you want to add something to that? Because I know you've had some experiences raising funding that didn't make you look exactly pleasantly, at least on giving
venture
up
capital,
control.
yeah.
Yeah.
But actually, if I back up, what I raised venture capital on was an internet idea. And I expect the crowd we're talking to here is a chemistry, it's a hard science crowd. And I mean, you see, just this is a backup overview comment. I think the US media tends to glorify this whole entrepreneurial bit. And everybody, when you think of entrepreneur, you think of, Mark Zuckerberg or Jeff Bezos. But, I had to struggle for 20 years before, I had good outcomes. And if you do the statistics, it's probably more people like me than the Bezos and Zuckerbergs of the world. So I don't think, just in general, this is not your question, Mark, but the driving force for entrepreneurship shouldn't, let me just say that I expect, hopefully it's not, but regardless, making a lot of money shouldn't be the prime motivation because there's no guarantee of it. Okay. So let me get that out of the way. But so to get a good idea and do it in the hard sciences field, chemistry, more than likely, you're probably not going to exit school unless you're an R&D group and something's being spun out of your R&D group, then that's your subject matter expert. You have to develop a business plan. That's one path. Assuming you're not in that scenario, then you have worked in a company for a few years. And so going to that, it's better for you to choose a high growth, larger company, and you'll, in a high growing sector, you'll find other ideas and you'll find other things. And you're much more credible for advisors, angels, whatever, if you worked in a space and you can talk through clearly rather than just, say it's $1 billion market, I'm going to get 2% of it, that kind of stuff. It's not going to fly as much. You always might find people give you money. So my experience, what's going to take to get money is, you need to be credible. You need to really know the market really well. And you have to have some kind of prototype and something else other than a patent and your own conviction that it's going to work. Usually you can raise money from friends, family, like David mentioned, grants and that kind of stuff to get to showing that your idea has merit. And, the easiest place to find angels outside of, actually, angels in the States is a very well-structured phenomenon. Every region has its angels. And, there's a lot of high net worth people who have funds and who want to deploy the funds in early stage high risk companies. But even they are not going to jump and fund you. They're not going to ask you these questions about how are we certain, does it work? And how does it stack up against the competition? And the easiest place for you to find an angel or find someone to help you is in your own company. That's why when you go there, you have to work your butt off, impress your bosses and, all the way up the company. And even if you left in 3-4 years, they should look at you as a star who's really contributed. And heck, either they're going to fund you or they may have access to people. And so that's a very credible reference. If somebody called me and said, hey, I know this person, they worked at my company and they've done this, as opposed to somebody telling me this is my friend or my relative and please help out, So a track record helps you both from a raising money standpoint and also knowing what you're talking about standpoint.
Yeah, sort of curious to get a little bit more perspective from you on your background because you've raised funds yourself rather than go to venture capitalists.
Yeah, my second go around, the venture cap, David kind of alluded to this, venture capital money is dilutive and it comes with very high expectations. A venture capital is placing, 25 to 50 bets. And they don't care if one or two or even 10 of those bets die. In fact, venture capitalists don't want a company to be, lukewarm. They want to either shoot the moon or just die and get off their balance sheets and get off their head. So you as an entrepreneur have a very different set of incentives and what you want out of life than the venture capitalists, right? So you're aligned only if you have a moonshot. So even Zuckerberg, actually, right? You go back to the movie, The Social Network, the smartest thing he ever did, and that's why he gave a lot of equity to that guy, I forget the guy's name, the president he hired who had dealt with venture capitalists, he knew how to negotiate the good terms. And that's what enabled him to keep control of his company. So venture capitalists are going to make you lose control of your company. So you shouldn't think angels are the smartest way, and then grants for a hard tech company. And then once you know that you're going to be able to hit the expectations that the venture capitalists are going to impose on you, that's when. And more than likely, if you're in a position to hit those expectations, the venture capitalists will be reaching out to you because you're probably going to be on their radar anyway. So that should, it's almost like you should wait till they come. I mean, no harm in talking to them and understand, because ultimately it comes down to terms you're able to get from them. And if you're able to get when we say terms, we mean you can't let them control your company, because then, they, again, like I said, their incentives are different. So they either wanted to really do really, really well or just exit and take the cash out.
Right.
So that's why on this go around, I use my own funding, friends and family, and then on the last couple of things, and then use grants to grow the companies.
Very good. And Fran, I know that you as an angel investor review a large number of possible investments over the course of a year. Could you talk a bit about that and how many you actually invest in, just to give a different the perspective from the other side?
Yeah, let me initially state that in the United States, there's about 300,000 angel investors. So there's a large pool of money out there to be obtained at the angel level. VC level is usually maybe 5 to 10 times greater than that in terms of absolute money. What we as investors like to see in a startup is they have finished their proof of concept and they have an early prototype that is either completely working or partially working. It would be very nice if they have tested it with customers so that they're able to get some revenue into the company. So those are a couple of things that we look for. The other thing is that everybody should realize that for any investor, especially at the angel level, since we have a tendency to invest in early stage companies, 50% of our bets will fail. For every 10 investments, 5 will go belly up. We will never get our money back. But the other 5, you will have maybe 1 or 2 that will break even, and you will have a home run, which I classify as anything greater than a 10x. That helps to pay for the ones that completely failed. When a startup approaches an angel group or an angel investor, there's a couple of things they need. They need an executive summary. And you can look up the definition of an executive summary. It's a 2-page document. There are formats out there that you can find. They would like to see the executive summary that tells us in a snapshot what your startup is about, what the problem you're trying to solve, what the solution is, what the market is, et cetera, what your advisory committee is like. And the other thing that you should focus in on is a set of slides that you're going to have to present to the investors. In the Lehigh Valley group, we have a rule, 10, 20, 30. 10 slides, 20 minutes of presentations, and 30 minutes of questions. So the startup who comes to us has 50 minutes, and then we cut them down. That's it. In 50 minutes, they're done. Either they still may be talking, but they're done. But we would like to limit it to 10 or so slides. I think probably since 2014, I have heard about 100 presentations or so, and no one abides by our 10, 20, 30 rule. No one brings 10 slides. It's either 15, 20, but the important thing, you have 50 minutes to convince somebody that your insight into a particular problem is unique. And if it's successful, it will reap a great return for the investor. I think that's about all I have to say about that.
Yeah, thanks, Fran. David, in your role as an operating partner at Ampersand, how do you review companies that are seeking funding?
We start, well, this is private equity, so this is a bit later stage, right? So I'll quickly qualify that, and then I'll go back to sort of the startup environment. But at the private equity level, and these are companies that are well on their way. They may only be 4 or 5 years old, but they're well on their way, or they could be more mature, 20, 30 years old. We look at the management team. We back management. We don't back a company per se. We back leaders, proven leaders, and that is and we have a it's a bias for action and decision making. People who are decisive and have a very clear idea what they want to do in markets that matter. So that's in a private equity mode, and we look to do that in partnership, meaning that we will make an investment in the company, but we expect the management to roll over their equity so that they have a continuing interest in the business, and they're not just going to leave and run to the Caribbean. Okay, back to sort of the startup area. I would say these are sort of the obvious things. You need to come forward with something that is important, understandable to the investors. Don't make it so overly complex science-wise that nobody, don't make it look like the Krebs cycle, and make it understandable, such that your grandmother could get it. And then you have to have a different business model. The world is littered with startup, biotech and science companies where the general administrative and the overhead costs and the rent end up being 60% of the burn rate, and only 30 or 40% goes to the science. Find a way for the capital that comes in to be used to actually add value to the business. Have that be 80 or 90%. And then be willing to, the limit or even beyond your limits, personally invest alongside your investors so that they are convinced that you believe yourself in what you're doing. So if you have some of those elements, then you'll have a greater chance, I think, of having some success getting funding.
Mark, can I add something to that?
Please do.
It's a general remark, not just for entrepreneurship, but it helps, especially if you have entrepreneurship, is the importance of mentors. Try to cultivate mentors, a habit of cultivating mentors along your career. And because, all the advice we're giving and you can get in the books, right? There's all standard stuff about, what you need a mentor to do is to take your very specific set of circumstances and then customize these suggestions for you, depending on where you are. So whether it's, doing well in any career of your choice, find people who have done that path either in that company at a senior level in the company you're in, or other companies where you can meet in conferences and other stuff. And generally people who achieve stuff in life are, contrary to what most people think, are, especially first generation people who've done it, they're open to giving advice and they're open to helping out, so long as it's not a big drain on their time. They're very open to doing that. Everybody, those of people who've done well in their life feel there's a certain amount of randomness to that, and they want to give back to that. And those mentors can help you not just in your career, but also in a business plan, also, vetting these things. So before you go to a Fran or a David, have it vetted by these people who know what they're doing, because, you only get one shot with a Fran or a David, but you can get a few shots with your mentors and refine it, such that both your message and all these things can be tightened. Because I've been fortunate in that regard in terms of, and even people you don't know that well, you'll be surprised if you reach out to them and, And it doesn't take a lot of time for a mentor to help you out and guide you in the right direction, all that kind of stuff. I mean, of course, you've got to be respectful of people's time. And when you send them an email, don't make it a general email about nobody's, you want to read the email and get a feeling like you know what you're talking about. You've done your research, you're asking specific questions, not please help me, I have no clue what I want to do, because then that's just going to be deleted, not going to respond. But if you communicate that and the easiest place to get a mentor is at your own workplace. If you've done really well, you've all the trappings of a star, then people want to help you out.
Yeah, I'd like to add one more point here, back to something that David has said. I tell entrepreneurs the elevator pitch is very important. You get on an elevator with a person, you go in between the first and second floor, the person get on the elevator with you has a $100,000 check. You have to convince that person before it gets to the second floor at a very high level what your startup is all about. And if you can do that, the money will come. Surprisingly, I said I've listened to 100 presentations since 2014. Able to get the elevator pitch is very important. Try to put your defining the problem and the solution in 3 or 4 sentences at a very high level. Sounds easy, but it's not. It's extremely difficult. And if you can't get that across to the investor, he will be completely lost right out of the gate, and he will not be listening to anything that you're saying because he's still trying to figure out what you're doing. So it's very important to get that pitch correct. And that's why going to a mentor, testing your ideas is very, very important. That's it.
Very good. And we've got just about 10 minutes or so left. And I want to encourage anybody who's listening here to please type in questions if you have them in the chat box, and we'll ask the participants and the panelists to respond. In the meantime, just had an additional question for Fran and for David, perhaps. Have you yourselves acted in a role as a mentor, and were they necessarily companies in which you or your firm has made an investment in, or have they been unsuccessful, perhaps initially in raising funding with you, but showed promise and you gave them some extra help because you thought there was something there you could encourage?
There's one particular company that the Lehigh Valley Angel Investor Group has invested funds in, and we've done it on 3 or 4 different occasions. And recently, I became a member of their scientific advisory committee. Not a board member, but the scientific advisory committee. So there is opportunities for the investor to give feedback to the entrepreneur through an advisory committee of some sort. I think that was part of your question. How do investors contribute to the entrepreneur? Some of our investors put in large chunks of money. We invest anywhere from $50,000 to $600,000 per investment. Some of the larger investments that come from 1 or 2 individuals, and they require board seats so they can control the use of their money. But a lot of us act as advisors to the startup that we invest in.
David, I think you wanted to say something.
Sure. And I was fortunate enough to serve on the Coulter Foundation Translational Research Board. And these are in a number of universities around the country where you have the combination of a medical school, a biomedical engineering department, and a whole other supportive range of basic and applied sciences. And what you do there is the PIs or even MDs will come forward and then with business ideas or ways to move something from proven science and turn it into a product or a business. And that was a wonderful mentoring program in which I participated for a while. And some of those have gone on out and become flourishing companies. But I would also say that if an angel firm or venture capital firm or private equity firm does make an investment in your company, in your startup, what Earl Nightingale said back in the 1950s still applies. And then in any organization of merit, the higher you go, the nicer the people seem to be and the more ethical they are. And so if you have the right investors, they will be good mentors for you. And the opposite is true. If you're in something where they're not really nice at the top, then you need to make other decisions. But mentoring actually comes naturally for an investment entity of merit.
Very, very good. We do have one question here I can pass along to you. It's from Paratosh Kulkarni, and that is, how do you approach and seek mentors? I think you've mentioned, David, one avenue that's somewhat academic. Are there other avenues, Roshan, Fran, David, that folks can go through to find mentors? Can it be in their academia, in their schools?
I mean, I'd say, the easiest place to find in general, the ones who are probably most useful for you are mentors in your field. A rich relative or a rich friend who's doing something different can give you some general advice, but the most useful mentors are ones who are in your general field. So you're likely to meet them either in your, company or adjacent companies, or, in industry associations or in conferences. But again, that mentor is going to be more receptive to you if, for instance, you've presented at that conference and you've done something interesting. It's just easier, right? When you meet somebody unknown, they're probably also going to get demands on their time. So they're always filtering, is this person a good investment of my time? And so the ways you can communicate that to them, even though you're young and you haven't had that much time to accomplish big stuff, but whatever little stuff you've presented something interesting, or in your email, you're saying to someone else, you've given a background which says what you are, what your background is, and what is your idea, what is you're trying to do, and what type of advice you'd like. And so long as that's specific enough that it communicates competence, and it never hurts to do it. At the most, they're not going to respond. And so as long as you do it well, you're going to get a pretty high hit rate, I'd say.
Thank you. David, did you want to add to that, or?
Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay.
Sorry.
Probably within 50 or 60 miles of the Lehigh Valley, Allentown, Pennsylvania, various universities have incubators. This is where a startup will go into a program where the incubator will teach skills to entrepreneurs. There's a Mid-Atlantic Diamond Ventures, that's an incubator out of Temple University. Ben Franklin of Pennsylvania has 4 regional incubators throughout the state of Pennsylvania. Keiretsu out of Philadelphia, they run an incubator program where entrepreneurs can join and learn some basic skills that may not be taught in their own institution. That's it. David?
Yeah, mentors like Roshan and others have said, they can be found a whole variety of places. One of the best ones I ever had, and I'm just going to give you a snippet here to show how it can happen, is I was a salesperson in the molecular spectroscopy company, and the chief financial officer was the most rude, angry-looking guy you've ever seen in your life, and everyone was afraid of him. Nobody talked to him. And one day he was eating his brown bag lunch at his desk, knocked on his door, and he goes, like, "What do you want?" And I said, "Henry, I'm just trying to understand, why do you always look so angry at everybody? And why is everybody so afraid of you?" And he looked at me and he asked me to come in and close the door. And he said, "Because nobody files their expense accounts on time. They don't involve me in the review of their contracts. And it all leads to all of these things. I don't know what's going on with the expenses in the company. I can't forecast anything." And so I said, okay. I'll start submitting mine more on time. And are you okay if I explain to everybody else why they need to do that. He said, sure. And so we rallied everybody and we changed the behavior in the company. And he took me under his wing and he taught me what the others were saying here, how to understand P&Ls and balance sheets and cash flow statements. So these mentors can come from the most unlikely places if you also sort of show your weak underbelly and you also want to start understanding how things work. So they're everywhere.
Thank you.
John said a lot of them are within your own company or your own organization.
So I just want to remind Mark, now we have reached 5 o'clock East Coast time, which, and we always try to start these exactly on time and end on time. I must say, I've really enjoyed listening to these panelists. Unbelievable comments and very, very useful. So Mark, thank you for assembling this group. I want to end with 2 notes. One is just to remind you that make sure you're on our emailing list so that you know of all the different events that we have. But also I want to make one personal comment, and that is in my career before I was in investment banking, I was at the oldest venture capital firm in this country called J.H. Whitney. It's now called Whitney & Co. It's founded in 1946 by John Hay Whitney with a bunch of his Army friends when World War II ended. And the head of J.H. Whitney when I joined was a fellow named Benno Schmidt, who was a legend in venture capital. And I remember once after I was here for about a year, I sat down with Benno over lunch. I said, Benno, tell me, what I was sort of at the knee of the guru. I said, what would be your, key words of success as a venture capitalist? He said, well, I have 2 comments. Number 1, don't spend a lot of time on something you're not going to do. That was his first comment, which I thought was really a wonderful comment. And the other was, he said, literally what David was saying, the key is management. He said, every time I've invested in an A product with a B team, they managed somehow to make the product a B product. And every time I invested in an A team and they had a B product, somehow they figured out how to make it an A product. So that was it. And I said, that's it? He said, that's it. So I just want to pass that on to you. And he was kind of a legend. And but I'm sure that matches the experiences of the panelists here. And but what great wisdom has been shared by this group. And I want to congratulate all of you. So thank you all. And we look forward to seeing you all who were attendees at our future events.
Peter, one last note before we go. Wanted to thank the panelists very much for their time. And in addition, Fran Waller has prepared a handout for anybody interested in startups and what they need to do to be involved. So if you'd like a copy of that handout, send an email to us at the Societe. It's SDCI1918@societe.org, and we will send you a copy of that handout.
Yeah,
Thank you very much.
And he won't charge any royalties, right?
No charge for that.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.